Hi, my name is Christian Devine and welcome to Retro View, a safe zone for physical media. I'd like to wish all of you a happy new year, despite our present day realities. And once again this year we're going to focus more on the physical media that we own and create, because that's going to be the dividing line in the future, I believe. And so please like and subscribe as usual. Now, because we're in the midst of the winter season, I thought we would look at a wintertime film, and it also has a present theatrical re-release, which is pretty amazing. And it's also a film that I don't love, even though I own it. And I'm talking, of course, about Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of Stephen King's book, The Shining. Now, I've always had a complicated relationship with this film because Stanley Kubrick is in my pantheon of top 3 directors. And my favorite film, as I've mentioned before in my Barry Lyndon retro review, which you should go check out right now if you haven't, and go check out Barry Lyndon if you haven't. My top 3 Stanley Kubrick films are 2001: A Space Odyssey, Dr. Strangelove, and Barry Lyndon, which rose immediately to the top after the first time I've seen it. And so, like I said, he's a master to me. And the thing about Stanley Kubrick films is often you do have to kind of go back to them, and because you kind of get more and more out of them with each viewing. Although I have to say this is not true of The Shining. And when I say it's Stanley Kubrick's worst movie,
are you out of your fucking mind?
Let me contextualize that by saying Stanley Kubrick's worst movie would be any other director's best movie.
Words of wisdom.
And so, technically, it's perfect. So it's not as if it's a matter of, technical, incompetence or something technical that's flawed about the film, because his films are always technically perfect. But it goes, beyond that into what the film is and what it isn't. And I've always been a huge Stephen King fan. The first book, in fact, of Stephen King's that I ever read was The Shining. A relative had it around the house when I was around 12 or 13. And I picked it up and I literally just opened the book up to the page where Jack Torrance is breaking through the door with the axe. And it actually scared me to death in the living room in the daytime. I still remember that moment very vividly, and of course I was hooked immediately and started reading the book. And one of the scariest scenes of any book I've ever read was the old lady in the bathtub in room 217, and I remember reading that in the classroom and being terrified. So I was already a voracious reader and little writer and artist and filmmaker, so Stephen King instantly shot to the top of my list. And I particularly do love his early work because that was when he was really hungry, and there's a kind of blue-collar horror metaphoric desperation that makes his work really powerful. And I absolutely love his book of short stories, Night Shift, which I think is the scariest book maybe ever written. And Salem's Lot, The Stand. I would read Cujo in one night, so I was a fan. And the first interview I ever read of Stephen King was in the graphic adult magazine Heavy Metal, aka TNA, sex and violence basically for, teens like me that were going through puberty, cultural puberty also. And so going from Marvel and DC to the world of adult graphic, art was a great transitional period for me. And in Heavy Metal magazine from 1980, the first interview I ever read with Stephen King was in there. And it's pretty terrific because he's on his way to becoming a phenomenon, but not quite there yet. But even then, in this interview, he's expressing displeasure about Jack Nicholson being cast in The Shining, and he would, over the years, become a lot more vocal about his displeasure with the film.
And there are an awful lot of things about that movie that I think are flawless and beautiful and just marvelous. And then there are other times when I feel as though I'd given Stanley Kubrick a live grenade and he heroically threw his body on it.
And one interesting thing about this interview in Heavy Metal, it's the only place I've ever read this, where the interviewer asked King about this rumor where Dick Smith was hired to create a replica of Jack Nicholson's head that splits open and worms comes out. Now, Dick Smith is the famous makeup artist who worked on The Exorcist, among other films. And so I always found that fascinating. I'm sure that if Dick Smith had worked on The Shining in any capacity, we would know about it, but he might have signed an NDA also. But it sounds almost too good to be true.
Usually what happens is, if you're writing a horror book, and this thing that I'm working on should turn out to be a real screamer if it goes the way that I want it to, you get an idea for something that's really nasty.
The Shining got me kick-started into Stephen King, became a huge fan, a voracious reader of his work, all the way up until the book It, which I thought should have been his greatest book, but outside of the amazing, iconic opening chapter, I found very disappointing. And it's okay, you know, you don't need to write 1,000,000 books to please somebody. I mean, his books, you know, did enough for me, and I referenced his work in the game Life is Strange, and other members of the team were big fans, obviously, too. So there was a Shining reference in Life is Strange. A couple of them, Easter eggs. Find them, and let me know if you know what they are. But I didn't see The Shining when it came out in the theater, and even though I was a big horror buff, and I'm not sure why I didn't go see it, even then I was a huge Stephen King fan, but I think it came out probably around the time when I was just getting into King, so. And Kubrick, who I knew already, you know, I wish I would have seen The Shining in the theater. I would have maybe colored my perception of the film differently. But when I finally did see it, probably on HBO or something a few years later, I was very disappointed. And of course, you know, when you read a book, compare a book to a film, there's going to be disappointment. But I found that I'm pretty objective, and I could take my senses away from the book. The Book of Jaws is completely different than the movie, and the movie is obviously far superior to the book in a lot of ways. And so I'm able to, you know, separate myself to a degree, but there's still some DNA in the book that makes you want to do the movie. And so if you get rid of that, it's become something different, which of course it is. And we're talking Stanley Kubrick here, who really wanted a big hit film because Barry Lyndon, you can see my other retro review on that, please, had not done well. And so he really wanted a box office hit. So there's a lot of like calculation about this. Stephen King, a up-and-coming best-selling horror writer, Jack Nicholson, of course, as the lead, etc. So it was very much, you know, and Stanley Kubrick wanted to see what he could do in the horror genre, just like he did with 2001: Space Odyssey in the science fiction genre. And I think the issue with The Shining for me is that Stanley Kubrick does not know horror films enough or understands how they work. And I'm sure he probably watched 1,000,000 of them before he made The Shining, because that was his MO, is to do massive research. But it's just not in his DNA, and I don't think he really gets on a gut level what makes, you know, certain horror films work. Some of his films do have elements of horror: Full Metal Jacket, Dr. Strangelove is a horrible satire, Clockwork Orange, etc. So he certainly knows how to do those things. But in this case, it just comes off to me much more like a BBC ghost story, like a very sedate BBC ghost story. And I love BBC ghost stories, but to me it just feels like somebody saying, and then he found out that he was the caretaker, you know, and it's just not as scary as the book. And I do think the film is miscast. Stephen King always wanted Michael Moriarty, this really terrific actor, you know, who would appear normal and then go crazy. And my big problem with the film is that Nicholson already had a reputation for being, you know, crazy, you know, because he'd already won the Oscar for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and his kind of grin, maniacal, diabolical, charming grin, was kind of part of his persona at that point. And also, I don't think the film, you know, as others have pointed out, gives you enough time to, you know, feel this transformation taking place. Jack Nicholson, or Jack Torrance in the film, doesn't feel normal from the get-go. And with only in a couple scenes, without too much family scenes, he's suddenly becoming, you know, possessed by the hotel. So I just really don't think that works. I didn't think it worked when I first saw it. And I'll be honest, Danny Lloyd, who's a terrific, you know, little actor in the film, but when he does the Randrum, I just started laughing. And it was made up for the movie. It's not in the book. And I just instantly started laughing. I just thought it was so silly. And the scenes with the family they don't feel like family scenes. Kubrick doesn't have that gift, that naturalism that the film needed. Like a Spielberg doing that scene, it'd be completely realistic. But with Kubrick, everything, of course, feels so calculated or gone through, you know, many takes. And Kubrick obviously was famous for doing takes over and over again, which kind of, to me, in the end, in many cases, just sucks the life out of, you know, the performers in the film. And I think Shelley Duvall's an amazing actress. I don't think she's amazing in The Shining, but she's doing what she's been told to do. I think she does Hysteria very well. But like I said, I just don't feel like that they are actually a family ever. And, you know, it's great to see Scatman Crothers in a Stanley Kubrick film, you know, but he's kind of giving short shift, you know, when he comes up to help rescue. There's almost no point to having him in the movie. So, and I think the scene in room 237, they had to change the room number for the film, with the old woman does not work at all the way it works in the novel. When Jack Torrance breaks through the bathroom door with the axe, it becomes a joke and loses the kind of horror. There's little moments where it's, you know, certainly when, you know, Shelley Duvall comes across the all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy typewritten page over and over again. That's pretty creepy and unnerving. There's other little moments. But, you know, I don't find it, it's just, like I said, it just feels very deliberate and slow in a way where it needs to be a little more, you know, visceral, I think. And I just think Nicholson really overacts, especially in the bar scene, whereas Joe Turkel, the bartender, wonderful actor who worked with Kubrick previously on Paths of Glory, you know, underacts beautifully. But like I said, I just don't find that it's scary enough. And the little moments of, like, when you flash to these skeletons in the room, which is a scene I always kind of missed. Every time it pops up, I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. But it's just so kind of sedate. The bear and the man in the bathroom, and the bear, the famous shot of the bear and the man in the bedroom. Who cares? You know, like I said, I just don't find enough to care about. And I don't think, you know, the child's shining ability and the fact that the Overlook is haunted, I don't feel that really dovetails together. Maybe it doesn't dovetail together as well. It probably works better in the book. It's still an odd two supernatural events, you know, colliding together. When the film came out, it was very critically, you know, pretty much panned. Although there's some certainly good reviews for it. It didn't do as well at the box office as Kubrick and Warner Brothers hoped. But shortly thereafter, it certainly developed a cult reputation like other Kubrick films have done. But now it's interesting to watch people watch it now in reaction videos or talk about it. And I think, you know, some of the responses are overstated. And these are just film debates that I like to have. There's no arguing about The Shining. I'm not going to get into a fight about The Shining. We've got other really more pressing issues. But this is a fun coffee shop beer debate that I would have, you know, that we could sit down and I would say, what do you mean you think The Shining's a masterpiece? But I understand why people do. And if you haven't seen it before, have no knowledge of it, it could work totally differently. And so, that said, and obviously some things didn't work because Kubrick altered the ending when it, you know, there was an original ending, another ending with a famous ending with Wendy in the hospital and the scene with the boy in the little ball, and Kubrick cut it out after the opening weekend. There's a different version overseas. It's a little bit shorter. So I think it's interesting too, like, well, how many films is this? Is like, you know, there's a longer American cut and there's a shorter European cut. So what film did Kubrick, you know, want to make? And like I said, you know, we can debate the virtues or non-virtues of that. But let's talk about the 4K. And I just gave you the reasons why I'm not a fan of The Shining. And now let's talk about why I own The Shining, because I think every Stanley Kubrick film is worth owning, particularly in 4K, and it looks magnificent. It's a really beautiful image, wonderful soundscape, and with great themes by Wendy Carlos. You know, unarguably maybe, the most important pioneer of electronic music, and who's also trans, just to throw that out there at a time when this seems to be some kind of issue. And of course, there's wonderful cinematography by John Alcott, who also did Terror Train later that year, just to show you the life of a camera person. And of course, the film introduced, you know, it wasn't the first time to use the Steadicam, but it used it in a way that really got people's attention. The great shots of Danny riding around on his Hot Wheels through the Overlook are great. You know, once again, visually, the film is, you know, you can't argue with it. It's gorgeous. Every shot is, Kubrick composed, whether it works or not, but it looks fantastic. The lighting is very stark in certain moments, and it's just got a great style to the film. So I love actually my favorite part of The Shining is the opening credits. That's the part that feels the most scary to me and the most promising, because you wonder what's going to happen. And I love the shots of that little Volkswagen cruising up through the mountains. So, and the music is fantastic, and it does feel a little creepy at that point. And so like I said, there are things like that are it's worth owning. And the 4K looks fantastic, and it's got a 5.1 sound mix. There's a little documentary by Vivian Kubrick, The Making of The Shining. I wish it was longer, of course. You can imagine that they probably shot tons of more stuff that we likely will never see behind the scenes. But this is like one of the rare examples where we really do get to see behind the scenes footage of, Jack Nicholson and getting ready to act and all these other nice little moments. And it would have been great to see more of this stuff. And there's a wonderful actual audio commentary, which I just listened to for the first time a few days ago, by the Steadicam inventor-operator Garrett Brown. And it's just, that's the kind of behind-the-scenes material that's fantastic to listen to, and it really goes into detail and makes you really appreciate the film visually even more. And like I said, there's with Kubrick's films, I'm always saying, I always say that I could be totally wrong. I saw Eyes Wide Shut, or Eyes Wide Shit, as I used to call it, on opening day, and I just really disliked it intensely. But it left something, inside me that, there's something like about it that makes you think about it. And I haven't decided whether I'm going to get the new Criterion 4K, which has been selling like hotcakes, which I'm happy to hear for them and for the fans of the film. And I just recently watched it. I rewatched my Blu-ray version, and I still have the same issues with it. I totally believe it was an unfinished film. Michael Herr, who co-wrote Full Metal Jacket, also said that. And I think it's pretty apparent that the film is not as tightly edited as Kubrick could have edited it. And because he was famous for even edited films right after the opening weekend, there's no way that he would not have cut out a few more minutes or juxtaposed certain scenes. But even, with its flaws, the film is worth owning and watching, and it's another seasonal film. So The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut are kind of two nice seasonal bookends. And maybe I'll get the Criterion at some point and talk further about the film and my issues with it. It's got certainly the fakest pot smoking scene in movie history. But it's also got some things in it that are really unique and interesting. Alan Cummings is great in his little scene, and the colors are very vivid, and when I saw it in the theater, I could still walk away remembering those, very vivid colors. So that's why I own The Shining. And even though I don't like it, it's a film that I will rewatch. And I always hope that I'm going to rewatch it again and hope that I'm going to like it and find something that I do. I just don't think it holds together. I don't think there's enough of a mystery, ghost mystery, or possession mystery that's solved. And the final ending scene, it just feels, like I said, a BBC ghost story. And that's not what I wanted from The Shining now, and it's not certainly what Stephen King wrote. But, that's the way the axe breaks. So, thank you so much for retro viewing, and take care.